My name is Natalie Doonan, and I started the Sensorium in 2011. So about 5 years ago, at around the same time when I started doing my PhD at Concordia. It's basically just founded and directed by myself, and it's a collaborative project, but the nature of those collaborations is always changing depending on the event that I'm working with.
Right. So could you explain what the Sensorium project is?
Sure. So the Sensorium is a series of artist-led tours and tastings in and around Montreal. And the goal of the project is to, first of all, elicit the senses, so engage the senses, and by doing that, encourage people to talk about food issues.
Great. You kind of elaborated on this a little bit. I don't know if you want to go into more detail about the mission of your organization.
Sure. So one of the reasons that I founded the project in the first place is because I was a newcomer to Montreal. Both of my parents are from the city, but I had never lived here before. And I was coming from Vancouver, so the other side of Canada. And when I was living there, I was doing a lot of tours of the city. So looking at things like development and displacement that was happening in the city. And when I moved here, I decided to bring food into that because I feel that tours and tastings are two of the primary ways that newcomers get to know cities, the way that they're introduced to cities. And I wanted to undo that a little bit or play with it a little bit. So I guess instead of calling them tours, you could call them detours, because I'm trying to get people to think critically about public space. And food is a really great way to do that because all of the events involve tasting something, taking something literally into the body so that you're literally ingesting parts of the neighborhood. It becomes an embodied way of learning and encouraging discussion, because a lot of the times when you're looking at projects that are trying to encourage discussion, it's through, the discussion is elicited through verbal means. So, asking questions, for example. The point of this is to create embodied situations that will, in a more natural kind of way, encourage conversations around a certain topic to unfold. So, what I was saying about coming to the city from Vancouver, the project on a personal level was also a way for me to get to know Montreal through its food systems. So that's what I've been continuing to do. It happens slowly. It's a long process.
Wonderful. Could you talk about the structure of your organization or project? I guess this is more of a project than an organization, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Could you
Unless you can consider me an organization.
Exactly. And I know this maybe applies differently to your project than other groups, but I don't know if there's any kind of like decision-making organization, or if you have an economic model or any kind of division of labor.
Yes. Well, it's loose, and so my background is in art. I'm a multimedia and performance artist, and so I'm used to working in a really fluid way and also a collaborative way. So the structure is really, well, fluid is the best word that I can think of, and it's really largely directed by me. So that's been partly out of necessity, just because as a PhD student and a mom and an artist, juggling many kind of things, I have to be able to adapt and change and respond according to what I'm able to do in the moment. So how that works with collaboration and funding structure. So in the first year of the project, I had just spent 6 months in New York as a visiting artist or visiting scholar at NYU. And what I had been doing is research into artists in New York City who use food and tours in their work. And so for the first year of the Sensorium, what I was doing is inviting artists that I had met in New York City to come and lead tours or workshops or performances around food here in Montreal. And so that's the way that the collaborations happened, is that I had identified artists who already use these forms in their work And I worked with them to sort of adapt projects that they had already created or established to the space here. So just to give you an example, the very first event, I had been thinking about the way that gallery openings usually work as a wine and cheese event. And so I invited an artist called Miriam Samoon, who at the time was making cheeses from human breast milk. And it was a sort of study of terroir. So you could look at all of the projects that I do as looking at the connections between taste and place, right? So she had been doing this as events in galleries, sort of high-end galleries, high-end events. And I was interested in making it a more casual kind of environment. So we held an event at Caffeine on Bishop, just across the street from Concordia. So it was in a bar, and we had also exhibited photos, which were images of the homes of women who had donated breast milk to make the cheeses for her project. And then she had also conducted interviews with those women, talking about breastfeeding and talking about their lives. So we had the interviews also that people could listen to. And she had also made a video showing the whole process of making the cheese from breast milk. And so all of this was on display, and people were invited to come and actually do a tasting of some cheeses that she had brought from New York. And so that's also an example of how, you know, the people's engagement is elicited in a sensory way, and then there's sort of informal conversation that naturally happens around why are we consuming cheese made from human breast milk, and dealing with immediate reactions of, say, disgust, and then questions that unfold from that around, well, if I'm disgusted by eating cheese from human breast milk, why doesn't cow cheese or sheep cheese disgust me? Why don't I ask the same questions, like where does the mother come from, what are her living conditions, and so on. So back to the question. That's one example of how I would identify an artist and start to work with them. And you can see that the nature of the work that the artist is doing sort of dictates what kind of event it will be and where it will take place and what kind of decisions I need to make there. So in that case, I had to collaborate with the owner of Caffeine. So it's a local business. And then I have to collaborate in other ways to fund the event. So one of the sources of funding that I've had is Sustainable Concordia. So they've been really supportive of the project over the last few years. And I've also gotten funding from all kinds of Concordia small project grants, as well as the Center for Sensory Studies, where I've been working as coordinator for the last few years. I've also, am I talking for too long?
No, that's great.
I would also say that in terms of collaborations, I'm always looking for other food groups that have similar objectives to me and trying to partner with them in various ways. And that also unfolds really dynamically and fluidly. So for instance, on another project that I did around foraging in the Mile End, I was introduced to a really fantastic urban forager called Leah Garfield Wright. And she and I and another artist called Taeyeon Ing Chan partnered on that project. And it was a project that unfolded over several weeks. And so it wasn't just most of the events I do are sort of one-time events. And in the first year, there was also, I would also organize an artist talk the day before the event. But in this case, we did it over several weeks because we wanted to invite the public to be part of actually constructing or creating the event itself. So we had a series of walks that we publicized through Facebook and also through posters around the Mile End and around Concordia, and through my mailing list. And people were invited to come and basically explore the Mile End and foraging in the Mile End. So we were looking for all kinds of different ways of eating for free in a neighborhood that is usually treated as a kind of, the way I think of it is as a stage, right? So there are expensive food tours that you can take to go and experience the front stage of the Mile End, whereas what we were interested in looking at was what I call the backstage, like the alleys and the dumpsters and the things that are thrown away that are perfectly edible. Um, and so we did that over, 5 different walks, and anybody who came to the walks was able to sort of direct our path. And then we brought all of that together, Tan and Leah and I, as a final walk through the Mile End, showing people how they could eat for free there. And Leah, the urban forager, had been in contact with Les Fruits Défendus. I don't know if you know that group. It's not a Concordia-based group, but a Montreal-based group that works with Centre Paul Roulant, which is another food group in Montreal. And what they do is to help homeowners who have fruiting trees but don't have time to harvest them. So they go and do all the harvesting, and then they divide the harvest in three. And the volunteer takes a third. A third goes to Centre Paul Roulant, who does a Meals on Wheels program. And then the other third goes to the homeowner. So because of that connection, we arranged that during the final tour, we would stop by a yard where Fruits Défendus was doing picking. So we stopped by there, and then people got introduced to one of the organizers, and he explained the project, and people on the tour picked some fruit, and so they got introduced to another organization as part of that too. And that's just to give you one example, but in all of the projects I do, I'm trying to look at different organizations that I can partner with to let people know that they exist, and also to enable the event to take place, whether it's to have a space or have a taste of something. So yeah, I think that sort of gives you an idea of how fluid it is and how it's always changing. I've also worked with people just by them contacting me through email and saying, hey, I do foraging, or I do cheese making, or whatever, do you want to work together? So we do it like that. And yeah, all of the promotion, the publicity, all of the recording of the events, I do most of it myself. In some cases, I've been able to hire people from funding I've gotten through the small grants that I told you about. So last year I was able to hire a student to design a catalog that documented the last year's event. So that's one thing that I've tried to do, is produce some kind of art catalog every year to as documentation of what's taken place. And I also, in terms of archiving the project, either and or videotape, take pictures, written documentation as well. And I put all of it up in its raw form on the website so that anybody can get information if they weren't able to take the tour or go to the event themselves. It's all there for them to use in whatever way they want. So, and just not to take all the credit myself, with the documentation, over time what's happened is people have ended up helping me. So my partner, Eric DeLeon, is a graphic designer, and he comes to a lot of the events, and over the last few years he's documented quite a bit as well, because before it was, I would literally be videotaping with one hand and taking pictures with the other, and then writing about it. So yeah, I end up getting help also in very fluid and dynamic ways.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That sounds really interesting. So could you explain a little bit about the history of your project?
The history. Okay, well, so do you mean talking about like specific events that have happened, or longer history, like why I got into it in the first place?
Yeah, so maybe like how did this all begin, and how did it get to where it is today?
Okay. Well, because I talked about the work that I was doing in New York and how that kind of segued into this. Did you want me to go back before that, or are you talking about?
Like maybe why? How did this organization or project actually start? Like, what was the catalyst for you beginning this project?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will go back a little bit to answer that. So before going to New York, I was living in Vancouver for 5 years, and I had been working with a collective that I co-founded before the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. So we were a group of three. We worked together as tour guides at the Vancouver Art Gallery, and so that sort of at some point we started asking ourselves, well, why don't we take this kind of model of doing tours that are organized thematically and turn it outwards and bring it into city spaces, because we saw what was happening to the city with it ramping up for the 2010 Olympics and all of the development and displacement that was happening, and we wanted to call attention to that. So, so we were doing urban detours, I guess. And so when I left Vancouver, I wanted to continue that work. And so that's what led me to doing the research that I talked about in New York, looking for other artists who were doing tours, but then also wanting to focus on food. And then when I finished that work, I wanted to put that research to work somehow in this new place where I was living. So that's kind of how it started. And I talked about how the first year was showcasing artists from New York City. After that, I wanted to focus more locally and use local resources to do that. So starting with the second year of the project, so in 2012, I started working just with Montreal-based artists. For the most part. There have been some exceptions to that. And I started looking at what resources Concordia has already in terms of food, so like the People's Potato and Sustainable Concordia and so on. And one of my advisors, Ted Rutland in geography, suggested the small project funding. So I was completely new to Concordia. I didn't know about these resources. So I started looking for different sources of small project funding, applied for those, and I was really lucky to get, I think, all of them right from the start. And so once I had the funding, I was able to, it's always been important to me to pay the artists and at the same time work on a kind of generosity platform, I guess. So in the first year, I was inviting artists from New York to actually stay at my apartment. So I give them the place to stay for free, but I paid for their airfare and I paid them a $500 artist fee from the funding that I got. So that artist fee has always been important for me in the ways that I collaborate as a way of recognizing all of that work. And then it's sort of continued in that same way. So in terms of publicity, in the first 4 years, I always printed advertising or promotion for the project. So I had posters that I would hang up here around the campus and in other strategic locations in the city, where there's food projects like Centre Palais Roulant, for example. And I made postcards. So because they're tours, postcards seemed like an appropriate kind of art form to use. But in the last year, since my funding started to diminish, I wasn't applying for as many things because I was trying to finish up my thesis, I stopped printing stuff, and I've just done all of the promotion through my Facebook page. So there's a Sensorium Facebook page and the website that I mentioned, which is set up as a blog. So it's all, and then using MailChimp. So I've managed to build up a mailing list over the last few years. So it's all gone out that way. And because the organization is really just me at its foundation, the upside of that is the flexibility, but the downside is that if I can't be operational, then nothing happens really. So I had a baby 10 months ago and haven't been able to do any events in that time. And then I've also graduated from my PhD in that time, so I don't have access to that small project funding anymore. So that is in the process of changing as well. So there's a transformation that is going to happen in the organization of the Sensorium. And in fact, I think the name will probably change too, because what's happened in the last couple of years is York University established a research center and took the name, which is causing some complications. So I think that now the way that the structure of the organization transforms is going to largely have to do with what kind of work I'm able to find. So, for example, if I were to get a tenure track position in a university, that would give me access to setting up the project as a research center, which has advantages like being able to continue to offer all of the events for free, which has been really important to me, as opposed to another example would be if I don't end up affiliated with a university and the project has to remain autonomous, then I think it would have to adopt a varied kind of funding structure. So, for instance, getting funding from Canada Council for the Arts, other kind of arts funding, art and sustainability funding, and I would probably have to have some events that are paid for in order to supplement the ones that are not, like that. So it's kind of in a moment of flux right now, and I've been planning events where I don't really need any funding, which of course changes the nature of the events themselves too, right? So yeah, that's kind of unstable right now.
That's great. You've kind of answered some of these questions, but I'm just going to ask you anyway. And if you want to add to it, you could.
Okay.
Or if you think you've already answered it, you could just let me know that too.
Okay, sure.
So I know you've talked about this in previous, but I don't know if you want to elaborate just specifically on it. But I'm wondering about the kind of partnerships you have. So is there any kind of formalized partnerships or?
No formalized partnerships. I mean, I've sort of I mean, it hasn't come up anyway as an issue where it's been presented to me, but I've sort of intentionally avoided formalized partnerships in order to maintain that flexibility and the autonomy. But in terms of more informal partnerships, as I mentioned, I've had a lot of support from the Center for Sensory Studies. So, like for promoting the events, that's been really helpful to have those events broadcast on the website and through their mailing list as well. And then on a event-based situation like La Ruche d'Or Saint-Henri, for example, I did one event in collaboration. I would say in collaboration with them because it's not formalized partnerships, but it's a location in St. Henry that has an art studio and a community garden that people can come and use on a drop-in basis for free. So I held one of my events there, starting there in the studio and then doing a tour along the Lachine Canal and then ending up in the community garden there. But it all of the events operate in that sort of way. So it's just sort of a one-time partnership, and usually they're people that I keep in contact with anyway. So like when I said building the project on a platform of generosity, it kind of by its nature I think is dynamic in that way too, like a friendship is, you keep in touch with these people. Maybe another project will come up where it makes sense to collaborate with them, or maybe not. When you're part of a community, it kind of ebbs and flows like that, and that's kind of how the project works.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I think you've also answered this one, but I'll ask you anyway, just in case you want to add to it. But what kind of events and activities do you run with Sensorium?
Well, maybe I could just mention a couple more to give you a sense of the range, because focus mainly on just telling you about the first one. But so we had one event that was with, I would say an artist, but she doesn't call herself an artist, Lena Gaznek. She calls herself a vegetable weaver. So we had an event at Centre Paul Roulant where, well, the proceeds went to Centre Paul Roulant, so that's kind of how the partnership worked in that sense, and they let us use their space. And it was a Valentine's Day event, so she showed people how to carve roses from local root vegetables. So it was a sustainable way of giving someone a flower for Valentine's Day instead of supporting the cut flower industry. And you could actually eat the flower too. That was delicious. So that's another example of a very different event. Another one, I arranged for a tour bus. It was a little yellow school bus, actually, to take people out to a modern dairy farm just outside the city, actually on the Ontario side of the border. And I worked with an artist called Joanna Autain. She's from France, but she actually lived here for a long time. She's gone back now, but she was living here and doing her master's here at Concordia. And her work was with small farmers, and she had done interviews with small farmers. And so we transformed the bus into an installation space, and people could listen to those interviews. They were actually invited to record their own interviews as well about experiences on farms. And they sampled sheep cheeses on the bus and local teas. And then we did a tour of the modern dairy farm, and people were able to talk to the farmer about how a modern dairy farm works. And for, I think maybe everybody on that tour is their first experience of a modern dairy farm. We don't usually come into contact with that as city dwellers, right? So, and then one last, I guess I would mention as an example, because I referred to it, the tour along the Lachine Canal. That was with Eric Moskapetis and Mia Rushton, who are two artists based in Calgary. And they created this mobile popsicle cart, and they spent some time doing research of that area along the Lachine Canal and what kind of plants grow there in the wild of the city. And they researched the uses of those plants, and they created pairings. So I think there were 3 different flavors of popsicles that they made with a different pairing in each case of 2 local plants. So for instance, there was one popsicle that paired what they called a utilitarian pear plant. So it grows pear fruit that you can actually eat, and a beautifying juniper plant, which people use to create barriers around their property, right? So bringing together this kind of working class plant with a beautifying plant. And then we stopped the tour at various points, and people were given popsicles and literally got to ingest the neighborhood, and became a way of talking about class and gentrification and how we use public space. So I think just in those few examples of projects, you get a sense of what kind of food performances happen at the events, but also that it's a huge range of different things. And like I said earlier, it's directed by the practices of the artists that I work with. Yeah.
Wonderful. Could you talk about some of the long-term and short-term goals of the project?
Yep. Well, my work outside of this particular project too focuses on the connections between taste and place, and I do storytelling. So a lot of what I do involves recording people's stories about food, and the connections of that food to particular places. And so what I've planned since I initiated the project is to kind of bring together my own artistic practice with this kind of curatorial project that I'm doing. And I think right now, how exactly that comes about is going to have a lot to do with, as I said, what kind of employment I get at this point, and what kind of, for example, what city I end up living in. I'm hoping that I can stay here in Montreal and keep building on these networks that we've been talking about. But if I have to go somewhere else, then it would be a matter of reestablishing those. But yeah, I think it will involve coming up with a new name for the project, which means establishing a new website and linking up to this archive that I've built up now over the last few years, but learning from it's a research creation project, right? So I've been learning gradually about methods of working that I'm incorporating into my own practice now, and that end up then like inflecting what I do with the Sensorium. So an example of what I mean by that is that I didn't imagine necessarily focusing on urban foraging, but it's become obvious to me through the interest in the events and the kind of emails that I get from people that people are really interested in urban foraging. And so I've been offering more events that incorporate urban foraging, and I'll continue to do that. And that's part of how the project is really flexible too, right? So as people contact me and ask me about events, then I'll respond by making them available too, or looking for people who are doing that kind of work, right? So yeah, I think I want to continue to work as flexibly as possible, and bring it together with my own artistic work. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, wonderful, great. Could you talk about some maybe the strengths and weaknesses of the project?
Yeah, I think the strengths and weaknesses I've kind of been talking about throughout, and they have to do with both being the main person responsible for the project, which gives me a lot of freedom, but then also a lot of it's challenging. There's a lot of responsibility being the person who has to get all of the funding and do the documentation and do the archiving and the promotion. So it would be nice to have, I'm just throwing this out here as an idea because I don't know exactly what the form will take in the future, but if it was, for instance, a research lab and I could hire somebody to help out with the project, that would be amazing, to have the help doing promotion and bring together the events and stuff like that, doing research. It would be great. So yeah, I think the main advantage and drawback is both that I'm working by myself most of the time.
I totally understand. So could you explain what your project brings to the Concordia community?
Well, when I started the project, as I mentioned, I was a student, and all of my funding was coming from Concordia, so it was really important for me to create a project that was for students, but not only for students, for the larger Montreal community. And I think one of the great things about Concordia is that it's a city university. It's embedded in the urban fabric. And I see the project from its inception as being that way too. And so it's been a way for students to have events, both artist talks and performances that have both to do with art and sustainability for free. So there have been a couple of times where I've charged something. For instance, that one that I talked about going out to the dairy farm, I charged $10 because the school bus alone costs $500. So, when there's been events that are more expensive to put together, I might have charged something small, but for the most part, they've been free. So it's to have, exciting, engaging, accessible events for students that also offer the opportunity to get politicized somehow, specifically with reference to Montreal's food systems, right? In a way that isn't preachy, So yeah, I think that's the main thing. And then depending on the event, there's been opportunities for students too. For instance, what I mentioned last year, hiring a student to do graphic design work. And in terms of how to contact me, then it's really easy. You just email info@lesensorium.com. I also mentioned there's a Facebook page. It's the Sensorium, and Twitter, and there's a website as well. It's lesensorium.com. So it's me again answering the email. If anybody was interested for whatever reason, I'm very responsive in that way. So I mentioned Joanna Oteng, who was a student who can't even remember how exactly we got connected, but that's how I ended up doing an event with her. And there was another MFA student here, Alexis Williams, who does amazing work with mushrooms, who ended up leading an event. And the way that unfolded was that she came out to a mushroom event that I did on Mont Royal, and we ended up getting to know each other, and I found out about her work. So then I invited her to lead an event as well. So yeah, that's about it.
That's wonderful. Great. You do really amazing work.
Thank you.
I'm very intrigued
nice
by your
of you.
project. Wonderful. I don't know if you have to go right away. I had one question that
No,
I
I still
wanted
have
to pick
time.
your brain with.
Yeah, sure.
I want to know what your, I guess, how would you conceive of an ideal food system at Concordia?
Yes, I read that question, and it's complex. That's a big question. But you asked some questions too about the involvement of private funding in public institutions, which, of course, as you know, is problematic on many levels, especially for people working in arts and humanities. I think Concordia has a great history and examples of how to run a great food system within a university, and has been moving towards that for the last 20, 30 years. I think it has to do with things that have already been taking place. So for example, taking vending machines off the campus and bringing in what are those called, where you fill up your water bottle.
Like the fountains?
Yeah, but the special like made just for water bottles, right? So to encourage people to fill up their water bottles instead of buying a can of Coke or bottled water, right? The People's Potato is another great example of a student-run food project where people can eat for free or very cheaply. So it's really accessible, and I think they provide an alternative to private corporations coming in and providing food sources that aren't necessarily sustainable and don't empower students in the same way. So I think as much as possible, all of the food available on Concordia should be run by students, operated by students, and accessible to students. So places like Frigo Vert as well, I think, is fantastic, offering the opportunity to have an alternative food source for groceries too. So I would like to see more and more of that happening, and I think that Concordia is a good example for other institutions to follow too.
Great.
I don't know if that answers enough, because it's a much bigger question than that, but
it's a very complicated question for sure. No, that's wonderful. I had one last little thing, but
sure.
I don't know.
No, I think we're still good.
Okay, great. What would you give to as advice to a student that wanted to get involved in the food movement at Concordia?
Yeah, well, there's so much to say, but I guess not to overwhelm them too. Some preliminary places that I would tell them to start would be going to Sustainable Concordia, because they fund and manage a whole bunch of different food initiatives at Concordia that are really interesting. I would tell them to get a membership at the Hive. I would tell them to try doing their grocery shopping at Frigo Vert. I would recommend that they take a course with Satoshi Ikeda, who works in food and globalization, teaches in food and globalization. And also Professor Rona Richmond Keneally has been working towards instituting a minor in food studies here at Concordia, and there's some really interesting courses available for students in that area, even in the intersection of fine arts and food, which is really interesting. So I would suggest that they look into that. What else? Maybe I tell them to come and have lunch at Cafe X or Burritoville. So yeah, I would definitely get them started by that. And also, you've got this amazing archive of projects now, so they can just search all of that online and know what's available.
Great.
And I think it's a great in for other projects in Montreal too, right? Because these Concordia-based projects are also connected in all kinds of ways to other things going on in Montreal.
Yeah, for sure. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.